When Cole Younger was buried, he had 14 bullets still in his body, and that's not including what the sawbones had already dug out. According to Cole, he had been shot a total of 20 times over the course of his life. He also spent 25 years in prison. And despite all of that, Cole still lived to be an old man. This dude was like the 50 Cent of Wild West history, only on steroids. You see, Cole was a member of the infamous James Younger gang, and back in 1876, they attempted to rob the First National Bank in Northville, Minnesota. And well, let's just say things did not go as planned. Not only did they fail to gain access to the bank safe, but they also got shot to pieces. 8 desperados may have ridden into Northville, but only 6 made it out alive. And within just a matter of days, 4 of those 6 would either be dead or in jail. Only Jesse James and his brother Frank eluded capture, displaying an almost superhuman level of endurance in the process. And that's what we're going to talk about today, what I consider to be the greatest manhunt in all of U.S. history. We'll also discuss Cole Younger and his various wounds, including the one he said was the most painful. Spoiler alert, it was not caused by a bullet. We'll examine Cole's life after he was captured, as well as the fate of his brothers. And make sure you stick around to the very end, because we'll also take a stab at whether or not Jesse James really made that jump across Devil's Gulch. We got a lot of ground to cover today, so without further ado, my name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Now, just as soon as the desperados fled Northville, they made a beeline to the town of Dundas. And believe it or not, the folks there in Dundas had not yet heard of the attempted bank robbery. That being the case, the owner of the hardware store initially pegged the bandits as drunken loafers. His words, not mine. He and a traveling salesman then started laughing and making fun at the boys, saying that they looked like they'd been running from Sitting Bull. To quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, "In a blur of movement, one of the robbers unholstered his pistol and pointed its big bore at the salesman, snarling, 'Get in the store, you son of a bitch.'" End of quote. So yeah, these guys definitely were not in the mood for small talk. Guess there's something about being shot multiple times that'll just cause a man to lose his sense of humor. As evidenced by them literally pistol whipping a farmer as they were leaving town. Remember, Bob Younger's horse was shot back in Northville, so they needed a replacement. And that farmer outside of Dundas just so happened to have a promising-looking draft horse pulling his wagon. It wasn't until he objected that one of the outlaws shucked iron and gave him a pop knot upside his head. Next stop was the town of Shieldsville, where, as fate would have it, a posse was already lying in wait. The only problem is they were waiting inside of the comfy confines of the saloon, fortifying their livers. And if that ain't bad enough, they left their wagon full of guns outside, unloaded and unguarded. Of course, by that point, Bob Younger was in pretty rough shape on account of that shattered elbow of his. And by the time they got to Shieldsville, he had lost so much blood that he fainted and fell off his horse. When an onlooker asked what was wrong with him, one of the boys just said that he was a captured horse thief. And that's about when that posse stepped out of the saloon. Per historian Ted Yeatman, a few moments later, the posse came to the doorway of the saloon, but found themselves staring at drawn revolvers. After warning the men to stay clear, they, the outlaws, shot up the water pump and rode off. End of quote. As to why they destroyed that water pump, I haven't got a clue. But unfortunately, they did wound a little girl. Far as I know, it was just a relatively minor wound. They just grazed her. I doubt it was done on purpose. But this was the second time that I'm aware of that the James Younger gang injured a child. I get that we love our outlaws, but if your job entails just constantly putting innocent people at risk, you might want to consider a career change. Now, just so happened that another posse arrived there in Shieldsville just a few minutes later, and they gave chase. In the running gunfight that ensued, Cole Younger was shot in his funny bone, or what he described as his crazy bone. At the same time, his brother Bob took another tumble from the saddle, but luckily he was able to get up behind Cole and they joined the others in making their getaway. They'd steal another horse not long thereafter, but it too was a draft horse, so they just turned it loose and Bob continued riding double. This would actually be somewhat of a theme going forward. There was not a shortage of horses there in Minnesota to steal, but many of them were draft animals and much more used to pulling a buggy than wearing a saddle. This would slow the outlaws down considerably early on in the escape. Now, that evening, the boys sought refuge at a farm. As I'm sure you can imagine, though, sleep did not come easily. They knew damn well they hadn't put enough distance between themselves and Northfield. Sure enough, at that very moment, at least 200 volunteers were combing the area. a number that would more than double in the days to come. Not only that, but the governor of Minnesota issued a $1,500 bounty. This too would double a week later to $3,000 per man. And that's not including the $500 per robber that the Northfield Bank had put up. Hell, even the telegraph operators were manning their stations 24/7. So yeah, needless to say, Jesse and the boys wouldn't tarry long. Every second they remained still, that noose just got tighter. They rode out early the next morning and exchanged gunfire with a posse as they crossed the Cannon River. Once they were on the other side, they stole 2 more horses from a farmer, in addition to taking the farmer's son as a hostage. They didn't hurt him, though, and the kid would later state that the bandits were mild-mannered and well-behaved, except when they drew their revolvers. I bet. Following day, September 9th, is when they just abandoned their horses altogether and continued on foot, staving off hunger by munching on whatever they could find growing in the forest. There were close calls. At one point, a posse got near enough for the bandits to hear them talking, but they remained elusive. And really, I think a lot of this initial success was on account of their experience as bushwhackers. After all, they were dodging authorities there in Minnesota, much the same way they did the Yankees and Redlegs during the war. When possible, they traveled through streams to hide their tracks. They'd also jump from one rock to the next and even walk single file in each other's footsteps, just basically doing whatever they could to confuse their pursuers. That said, as much endurance as they undoubtedly had, as much cunning as they displayed, they were still human, and there just were no way they could keep up that grueling pace indefinitely. Hell, in addition to their injuries, they were also dealing with a cold and drizzling rain. And other than a few rubber-coated blankets, they really didn't have much in the way of shelter. What scant food they had was scavenged. But still, they pressed on. Miserable as hell, but guess it beats the alternative. That evening, they camped north of Marysburg before pushing south to Madison Lake. From there, they hiked all night till they found an abandoned house a few miles outside of Mankato. Yeah, Mankato. It's not Mankato, okay? It's Mankato. Ask me how I know. Anyway, it's there where they'd stay for the next 3 days, just tending to their wounds and trying to stay dry. Once they emerged, however, they were almost immediately spotted by a farmer. So they took him hostage, sort of like they did to that kid a few days prior. And according to Cole Younger, they did debate whether or not to kill him. Quote, "Some of the boys wanted to kill him on the theory that dead men tell no tales, while others urged binding him and leaving him in the woods. Finally, we administered to him an oath not to betray our whereabouts until we had time to make our escape, and he agreed not to. No sooner, however, was he released than he made a post-haste into Mankato to announce our presence, and in a few moments, another posse was looking for us." End of quote. And yeah, posse or no posse, the boys still marched to the heart of Mankato later on that night under the cover of dark, crossing the Blue Earth River around 2 a.m. Once on the other side, they stole some chickens, marched another 3 miles before cooking dinner, likely their first real meal in days. That said, I'm not entirely sure how much they were able to enjoy. Another posse did approach, so once more they had to take to the brush, leaving the food and several pieces of clothing behind. Clothing that I can only assume they were trying to dry out. Finally, on September 14th, a full week after that botched robbery, they decided to split up. Cole stayed with his brothers and Charlie Pitts as Jesse and Frank went off on their own. Per Cole Younger, this decision was made with the knowledge and consent of the others. I think part of it was just their usual tactic of splitting up after a heist. But something tells me that Jesse knew they wouldn't make it very far with Bob's injuries slowing them down. Cole and Jim damn sure weren't going to abandon their brother, and I guess Pitts figured he'd stick with them as well. As for Jesse and Frank, they stole another horse and rode double throughout the night. Leastways they did before hitting a picket line near Lake Crystal, about 14 miles southwest of Mankato. One of the guards saw him trying to slip past and opened up with his scatter gun, blowing them both plumb out the saddle. That stolen horse took off running as Jesse and Frank fled through a cornfield. According to historian T.J. Stiles, the spray of pellets caught Frank in the right foot and Jesse in his right knee. One of them was struck in the side, and Jesse even had his hat blown off his head. Another close call, but despite these fresh wounds, the brothers pressed on. They also stole a pair of fresh horses later on that morning from a Baptist minister. Legend has it that when Frank and Jesse broke into the preacher's barn, he was waiting for him with a shotgun. Before he could take aim, one of the brothers lunged forward and slapped it out of his hands. They then pistol whipped him for good measure and made off with his horses. Pretty cool story, but I'm not sure how true it is. They definitely stole those horses from the preacher, but from what I can tell, historians are still debating whether or not anyone got pistol whipped. Meanwhile, the Youngers and Charlie Pitts were still on foot, and per the great Mark Lee Gardner, quote, Minnesota had become their living hell. And yeah, you gotta think, these boys were wounded, soaking wet, freezing, exhausted, and half-starved. Hell, by that point, Cole Younger was reduced to walking with a makeshift cane, and not just on account of that bullet he took to the leg back in Northfield. Dude had been walking so long in his wet riding boots that his damn toenails had fallen off. As badly as Cole would end up being wounded, he would later state that it was his toes that caused him the most pain. And his brother Bob was even worse off. In addition to losing all that blood, he couldn't even straighten out his right arm or control his fingers. Suffice it to say, things were getting pretty dire. So much so that they let their guard down on September 21st and approached a farm looking for food. An action that Bob Younger would describe as very imprudent, but we were so fearfully hungry. Sure enough, they were spotted and surrounded by a posse. And after a brief gunfight, Bob hollered out that he wanted to surrender, adding that his compadres were either dead or shot all to pieces. His brother Cole would later state that everyone other than Bob had been cut down pretty much during the first volley. Said he was trying to take aim at the posse, and next thing you knew, he was laying on the ground bleeding. Now, these various injuries are very hard to keep track of. Hell, Cole himself would oftentimes give out different numbers, but I am going to try to do my best to give you a proper rundown. Okay, so we know Cole was shot in the leg at Northfield. We also know he got hit in the funny bone, and his damn toenails had fallen off during the manhunt. And then, during that fight with the posse, Cole took a load of buckshot to his left side. He also got shot in the face. I'm not really sure as to the exact details. Sources are a bit conflicting, but he apparently took a rifle ball just under his right eye. He also had 4 bullets in his back, 1 in his arm, and possibly another just behind his left armpit. And believe it or not, he still wanted to keep fighting. Per one of the possemen, Cole, quote, offered to fight 2 of our best men at once. He said he had been dogged for 2 weeks in the rain with no food, but he could lick 2 of our best men. And when his brother Bob tried to talk him down, Cole stated he didn't care whether or not they hanged him. Said he'd just as soon hang today as he would tomorrow. His brother Jim was also shot in the face. The bullet knocked out several of his teeth before lodging in the roof of his mouth. Ugh. And that's in addition to being hit in the leg with buckshot and the bullet he took to the shoulder in Northfield. Now, as for Bob, once again, sources do differ, but supposedly he was shot through the lung. Remember, his elbow was shattered a couple weeks earlier, courtesy of Dr. Willer and that 50 caliber carbine. And then when Bob went to surrender, one of the deputies shot him again under his right arm. Other sources say that he was also shot in the back with the bullet exiting near his nipple. As for the 4th man, Samuel Wells, aka Charlie Pitts, his bank robbing days had come to an abrupt end. Ironically, Charlie had tried to talk Cole into running as soon as they spotted that posse, only for Cole to respond, Sam, if you want to go out and surrender, go on. But this is where Cole Younger dies. Of course, then the exact opposite ended up happening. Pitts chose to stay, and then moments later, the sheriff drilled him through the heart. Supposedly, he had additional wounds on his right arm and right hip, but I'm not really sure if he got those during this fight or back in Northfield. Now, as soon as the smoke cleared, the Youngers were hauled to Madelia in the back of a wagon, only to be greeted by a throng of onlookers. Jim, with blood still streaming down his face, managed to wave his hat to the crowd as Cole struggled to his feet and took a bow. An eyewitness would later say that Cole may have been an outlaw, but many of us that day admired his nerve, for he was a man who could take it on the chin and still smile. And yeah, you gotta hand it to Cole Younger, man. Dude had nerves of steel. Now, later on that night, when the inevitable lynch mob arrived, Cole told the sheriff, I don't want any man to risk his life for us, but if they do come, give us our pistols, so we can make a fight for it. Luckily for all involved, the mob soon dispersed, and that was that. Now, it's also there in Madelia where the Youngers had their photos taken. Chances are you've already seen these pictures. They're pretty well known, but they are oftentimes mislabeled. Cole is the one with the right side of his face swollen. Jim looks to still be dazed with the front of his shirt stained with blood, and Bob, despite all he had been through, looks pretty normal. Even appears to have a slight smile on his face. You would never in a million years be able to guess how badly wounded he was just by going off that picture. Charlie Pitts was also photographed. Kind of creepy considering that he was dead, but if you're curious, you can find it online. They took his shirt off, so the hole in his chest is clearly visible. Now, from Adelia, the boys were transported via train to Mankato. And once again, there was a huge crowd to greet them. Folks even lined up to shake their hands. Finally, they arrived in the town of Faribault, where they were placed behind bars. By the way, although Cole and his brothers readily admitted their own true identities, they still refused to give up Frank and Jesse. Even years later, when Cole wrote his memoirs, he didn't name them. When a reporter lied and said that the James boys had been apprehended, Cole did seem to be visibly affected. Asked if they said anything about he and his brothers, and when the journalist replied that they had not, Cole smiled and said, "Good boys to the last." This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by ExpressVPN. You ever watch porn? Yeah, me neither. But just in case you got a friend that does, you might want to pass on this important public service announcement. Incognito mode does not make you incognito. Don't believe me? Just check out the fine print. All of your late night activities are still 100% visible to third parties, unless you use ExpressVPN. And yes, that includes your internet service provider, your mobile network provider, and whoever the admins are for your Wi-Fi network, be they your boss, your school, or even your parents. But with ExpressVPN, your traffic is rerouted through secure encrypted servers, thus blocking those pesky third parties from seeing your browsing history. And no, ExpressVPN is not the only VPN provider that offers these protections. But one of the things that makes ExpressVPN stand out is the ease of use. You just fire up the app, click one button, and you're protected. Works on all devices, your phone, laptop, tablet, and even smart TVs. Express is also rated #1 by top tech reviewers like CNET and The Verge. Look, I use a VPN all the time, especially considering all the weird stuff I gotta look up while doing research for this show. And now you too can be protected. So what are you waiting on? Protect your online privacy today by visiting expressvpn.com/wildwest. That's expressvpn.com/wildwest, and you can get an extra 4 months free. expressvpn.com/wildwest. Now, let's get back to the show. Now, we will circle back to the Youngers here in a bit, but contrary to that reporter, Jesse and Frank had most definitely not been captured. On September 15th, they stopped at a farm northwest of Madelia. Later that night, they stayed with a German family south of Lamberton. Crossed the Des Moines River the following day and just kept riding throughout the night. Now, the next morning, they were about 9 miles northeast of Laverne, where they stopped at yet another farm looking for a meal. The man of the house was gone, but his wife was nice enough to invite him inside and cook him breakfast. She'd later recall that they were gentlemanly in their address and that they looked like brothers. They were also hurting something fierce. Per historian T.J. Stiles, they, quote, radiated physical agony as they shuffled into the kitchen, barely able to lift their feet. They had spent the last 24 hours on horseback, in the same clothes they had worn for 10 days through pounding rain. In addition to exhaustion and muscle pain, they must have suffered from chafed and peeling skin inside their thighs. Their wounds affected them as well. Though they refused to unbutton their raincoats, reaching up under them to get money to pay for their meal, one of them was obviously injured in the right side, his garment being torn there, and he could barely sit up to eat. But the iron will they had inherited from their mother drove them on. End of quote. And just to give you an idea how bad off they were, Jesse and Frank had to climb up on a fence just to get back in the saddle. Now, you may be wondering, why had they not yet been captured? Considering that they could barely move and the fact that there were hundreds of people out there hunting for them. Well, you got to keep in mind that many of their pursuers were married men who loved their families and desperately wanted to make it back home to them in one piece. That being the case, they may not have been all that fired up to go toe-to-toe with a cornered and very much pissed off Jesse James. Hell, later on, when a sheriff out of Rock County spied Jesse and Frank a couple hundred yards in the distance, he declined to pursue. Guess he just didn't want to risk it. The James boys may have been hobbled, but they were still mean as hell. What's more, they knew how to swallow that misery and just keep on a-going. Look, I am not a tough man by any means. About a week ago, I drove all the way to the tire shop so they could fill up my tires. Why? Because it was too cold for me to do it myself. And you want to know the worst part? When I got to the shop, it was a girl who did all the work. Well, I just sat there in front of the heater looking stupid. Compared to Jesse and Frank James, I am a pussy. But that said, it has been my experience that when things get challenging, if you just keep your head down and you keep moving, no matter what, Even when everything inside of you is wanting to quit, if you just keep plodding on, just one foot in front of the other, you will make progress. Amazing things happen when you refuse to quit. Jesse and Frank had been through tough times in the past, and they knew full well it wasn't over until it was over. They may have been hurting, but they were still free. To paraphrase Al Swearingen from HBO's Deadwood, pain or damage don't end the world, or despair, or fucking bullets. The world ends when you're dead. And just like I said, the James boys were still very much alive, and the word quit just weren't in their vocabulary. Indeed, one of their pursuers would later state that in every way they were masters of the situation. Their bravery and their endurance on horseback for days and nights, wounded and almost starving and without sleep, are without parallel in the history of crime. Now later on that evening is when they crossed over into South Dakota, which of course at that time was just Dakota territory. The horses were played out, so they stole 2 more near present-day Palisades State Park, only to discover that the new horses were blind. A few miles later, they swapped again, this time for ponies they could actually see, and by sunrise, they had already made it past Sioux Falls. They spent another rainy night at a farm before crossing the Sioux River into Iowa. There was a brief skirmish with the posse, but by the time reinforcements arrived, the James boys were long gone. Skip ahead to September 20th, round about noon, and they confronted a doctor by the name of Henry Mosher, some 25 miles north of Sioux City. The doc was on his way to treat a patient, but I guess the brothers figured he was some sort of detective, so they held him at gunpoint. They also took his clothing. And when I say they took his clothing, I'm talking everything, including his underwear. In turn, they gave him their old rags. According to Mosher, Jesse's coat was perforated with bullet holes. From there, the boys pushed on to the outskirts of Ida Grove, where they conversed with the young girl that was eating a potato. Per Mark Lee Gardner, quote, they joked with the girl a bit, politely declined her offer of some of the raw potato, and spurring their horses, dashed away. When last seen, Jesse and Frank appeared to be riding for the North Raccoon River, below Sac City, end quote. And from there, they pretty much vanished. Doesn't take a genius to figure out where they were headed, though, right? From Sac City, or is it Sock City? I honestly don't know. From that city, it's just another 250 miles straight south to their mama's farm in Clay County. And that being the case, the authorities there in Missouri were on high alert. So much so that on October 13th, they spotted Frank James near Independence, took him into custody. He was then put on a train and hauled to St. Louis, where it was determined that they had arrested the wrong man. The guy they caught was actually just a cattle trader out of Louisiana. Total case of mistaken identity. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if Jesse and Frank had even made it back to Missouri by mid-October. We also don't know the exact route they took in getting there. According to a friend of theirs, rather than traveling through Iowa, they instead turned west and then south, passing through Nebraska, Kansas, and present-day Oklahoma before swinging northeast into Missouri. Which does sort of make sense, especially if the law was suspecting them to be arriving from the north. Years later, Bob and Charlie Ford would share a similar story, as would future gang member Dick Little. Only in his version, they stole a wagon. Jesse drove as the wounded Frank convalesced in the back. And according to former bushwhacker Jim Cummins, they traveled as far west as Arizona before turning back east into Missouri. Whatever the case, they would indeed return. I'm not sure about Frank, but Jesse allegedly hid out in the home of General Joe Shelby over in Lafayette County. They would also have a close call with Sheriff Groom of Clay County when they decided to pay a visit to their mother's farm. But just like always, Jesse and Frank were able to slip away. Not only that, but they taunted the sheriff and his deputies while they did so, calling them cowardly sons of bitches. To once more quote Mr. Gardner from his book Shot All to Hell, as the brothers recovered, Jesse remained strangely silent. There were no letters from the outlaw denying that he and Frank had participated in the raid. No naming of alibis from the best citizens of western Missouri. No offer to come in if guaranteed a fair trial. The brothers had had the wind knocked out of them, and in addition to laying low, there was much to ponder. Meanwhile, their law-abiding enemies celebrated the end of the infamous James Younger Band. The breaking up of this powerful and dangerous gang of outlaws is the most important event which has happened in the criminal history of this country, proclaimed the St. Louis Globe. But Jesse and Frank were not done yet. End of quote. And yeah, the James boys still had quite a few adventures in store, which we will get to. As for the Youngers up there in Minnesota, they ended up pleading guilty. And while they were able to escape a hangman's noose, they did still get sentenced to life in prison. Matter of fact, Bob Younger would actually pass away there at the Stillwater prison in 1889 from tuberculosis. 12 years later, in 1901, is when Cole and Jim were finally paroled after 25 long years behind bars. Can't even imagine that. Now, this was not an unconditional pardon, at least not yet. They were still technically wards of the state, so they couldn't just pick up and head back home to Missouri. Jim got himself a job at a cigar shop, and for a while, he seemed to be doing okay. Even met him a nice young lady nearly 30 years his junior. Only problem was they couldn't get married without the governor's permission, and for whatever reason, the governor denied his request. From there, Jim just sort of spiraled. And sadly, in October of 1902, he got his hands on a little snub-nosed .38, pressed it to his head, and bid Minnesota goodbye. Older brother Cole would fare a bit better. He did receive a full pardon following Jim's death and returned to Missouri. He ended up writing his memoirs, The True Story of Cole Younger, in which he only admitted to one crime, the attempted robbery up there in Northfield. Later, he'd tour the country giving lectures and even star in his own Wild West show. Finally, in 1912, Cole found religion and got baptized. And then 2 years later, at the age of 72, is when he gave up the ghost. You can find Cole resting next to his brothers at Lee's Summit Historical Cemetery in Jackson County, Missouri. Now I know what you're thinking. What in the hell ever happened to the remains of Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, and Bill Chadwell? And the answer is nobody knows. Remember, Chadwell and Miller were killed in Northfield, and Pitts, of course, met his demise when he and the Youngers faced off with that posse. So here's the thing. If you'll recall, one of the Northfield defenders was a young medical student named Henry Willer. He'd go on to practice medicine in North Dakota, and for a number of years, Willer kept a full-size human skeleton on display in his office. A skeleton that he claimed was Clell Miller. Well, actually, at first he claimed that it was Bill Chadwell, and later on he admitted it was Miller. Now, although both Miller and Chadwell were initially buried in Northfield, their bodies were soon exhumed and sent to the University of Michigan. The cadavers were dissected and then placed in lead boxes that were filled with some sort of a preservative. And this happened very quickly, by the way, just 13 days after they were killed. Then on October 12th, Miller's family traveled to Michigan and retrieved his remains, or at least what they thought were his remains. Even though the bodies were preserved, there was still a good deal of bloating and discoloration. So I guess the idea of the family not being able to recognize him isn't completely out of the realm of possibility. Possibility. I feel like I said that weird. Of course, the other body was then obtained by Dr. Willer and displayed in his office. And like I said, Willer would eventually admit that it was Clell as opposed to Chadwell. And then, just before the doctor died in 1930, he donated the skeleton to a private collector. Skip ahead all the way to the year 2010, and a team from Minnesota State University did a series of tests on said skeleton. They tried getting DNA, but when that didn't pan out, they did a forensics test on the skull. Their conclusion was that it could possibly be Miller. Important to note that forensics ain't exactly a settled science, so the results are oftentimes inconclusive or incorrect. The next step would be to dig up whoever's in Miller's grave and do even more tests. They got Miller's last known next of kin to agree to it, but I guess officials down in Missouri are refusing to get on board. Last I heard, the entire thing was placed on hold, and that was back in 2013, so who knows if it'll ever happen. So yeah, long story short, one of the two men killed in Northfield, either Clell Miller or Bill Chadwell, ended up getting buried in Missouri under a gravestone bearing Miller's name. And the other was put on display in a damn doctor's office. As for Charlie Pitts, his remains are likewise shrouded in mystery. Remember, Pitts was taken to Madelia and photographed, along with the Youngers, after which his body somehow ended up in the hands of yet another crazy-ass doctor, a guy named John Murphy. He and his students dissected the body and then sunk him in Lake Como, just so he could finish decomposing. And then they just sort of forgot about him. Charlie's remains weren't discovered until December of 1879, when a family there at the lake pried open a box that they found sticking out of the frozen water. They contacted the sheriff, who treated it like an unsolved mystery until Doc Murphy came forward to claim it. He then took what was left to Chicago and gave it to one of his colleagues, another weirdo doctor. And what happened to Pitts after that is anyone's guess. The only thing that remains, so far as I'm aware, is a piece of his scalp and one of his ears. which I believe are now in the possession of the Northfield Historical Society. Double check me on that, though. The whole damn thing reminds me of that Wyoming outlaw, Big Nose George. Remember him? How they made an ashtray out of his skull and shoes out of his skin? What in the hell was wrong with doctors back in the 19th century? Okay, and finally, just to wrap things up, let's go ahead and discuss that jump that Jesse James allegedly made across Devil's Gulch. If you're not aware, Devil's Gulch is located not far from Garretson, South Dakota. I've seen varying estimates, but it's said to be somewhere between 18 to 20 feet wide with a 60-foot drop. And per legend, Jesse jumped his horse across the gulch when he and Frank were running from one of those posses. Now, this is still very much a debated topic, and there are many who think that such a feat would be impossible. I am not one of those people. Horses can absolutely jump 20 feet. That's been proven. And so can humans. The record long jump by a human was something like 29 feet. So yes, it would physically be possible for Jesse to jump his horse across that gulch. For that matter, it would have been possible for him to do it himself minus the horse. But just because something is possible doesn't mean it's probable, right? You got to keep in mind that Jesse and Frank were still riding those ponies they stole back in Minnesota, and they had been pushing them very hard. Mark Gardner put it best when he opined that the horses likely weren't even able to jump over a puddle at that point, much less a gulch. And remember, both Jesse and Frank were dealing with wounds of their own. Also, the first official mention of the jump, so far as I'm aware, comes from a 1924 newspaper article, over 50 years after the fact. Now, the more I dug into it, it doesn't even appear as if anyone in the posse even claimed to witness the jump. There are dubious rumors concerning affidavits signed by members of the posse, but apparently nobody nowadays knows where those affidavits can be located. Sort of like Brushy Bill Roberts in his autopsy. Also, we don't know for sure that they were even at the gulch. They were nearby, that much is absolutely certain. But just going off their known movements, it seems much more likely that they crossed Split Rock Creek several miles to the south. So yeah, like I said, it is possible the jump could have occurred. Jesse and Frank were in the general vicinity, and such a leap would not have been against the laws of physics. That said, just going by what little evidence I have at my disposal, along with my very flawed ability to reason and apply logic, with my little pea-sized squirrel brain, I'm going to lean towards the jump probably not happening. If you disagree or you have additional information, please do not hesitate to hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. And for the guy that keeps asking, no, I still have not seen the Jesse James Brady Bunch episode. Sorry. I'm actually not sure if I've ever seen an episode of the Brady Bunch. A little before my time. I was more of a Fraggle Rock and Night Court kind of guy. Oh, and before I forget, if you still want to hear more about Cole Younger, check out a recent edition of the Wild West newsletter. I discuss an unlikely friend that Cole made just days before the Northfield robbery. A friend who would play an integral role in securing his release from prison. Link down below, or you can read it for free at wildwestnewsletter.com. All right, that's it for today. Please join me here next week to discuss the final days and the death of Jesse James. Until then, adios.